The year of our Lord 1876 was a cruel one. It etched its harsh signature onto the land of the West, leaving behind a testament of dust and despair. The sun was not a giver of life but a tyrant, a relentless brass eye in a bleached white sky that baked the earth until it fractured into a web of deep, thirsty cracks. The creeks had long since surrendered, their once proud currents reduced to a memory whispered through dry, rustling cottonwoods. What little grass remained was the color of old straw, brittle and sharp, offering no comfort to the gaunt cattle that stood listlessly, their ribs a stark catechism of starvation. For the people scattered across this unforgiving expanse, life was a gamble wagered against the elements. They were a hardy folk, their faces weathered maps of endurance, their hands calloused and cracked from wrestling a living from the stubborn soil. Their existence was tethered to the whims of the sky, a fragile hope planted with each meager seed, a prayer for a rain that seldom came. Here, law was a distant concept, a polite fiction spoken of in towns far to the east. Out here, justice was a heavier, colder thing. It lived in the worn leather of a holster and spoke its final, irrefutable truth from the barrel of a gun. Into this crucible of dust and silence, Wade Harland had returned. He came back not from a journey of discovery or fortune, but from the grinding, soul-crushing maw of the Civil War. He had left a boy, full of fire and conviction, and returned a man hollowed out by what he had seen and done. The war had left its mark on him, both inside and out. A piece of shrapnel buried deep in his left thigh gave him a permanent, nagging limp, a constant reminder of the bloody chaos of Shiloh. But that was a clean wound compared to the ones that festered in his memory, the faces of friends lost, the deafening roar of cannons, the quiet, chilling moments after a battle when the air was thick with the scent of iron and finality. He had come home to inherit a ranch that was itself a casualty, the Harland homestead. Once a place of pride and modest prosperity, was now a portrait of decay. The fences sagged, their posts leaning like tired old men. The barn roof had a gaping hole that stared up at the merciless sky, and the main house was a collection of drafts and creaks, its paint peeled away by years of sun and wind. The land, his birthright, was as broken as he was. And then there was the debt, a heavy, suffocating weight that clung to him like the fine dust that settled on everything. The bank in town held the note, and Mr. Abernathy, a man with eyes as cold and gray as river stones, was not known for his patience. Wade was losing. The war on the battlefield was over, but the war for his home, for his very survival, was one he fought alone every single day. If Wade was a man defined by his visible scars and unspoken burdens, Eliza Boone was a woman forged in silence and steel. She was a widow, a hired cook living in the small outbuilding behind the Harland main house. But those simple words failed to capture the substance of her. Eliza moved with a quiet efficiency that seemed to waste no motion. Her hands, though often dusted with flour or stained with garden dirt, were strong and sure. She was not a beautiful woman in the way the ladies in town were. There was no soft delicacy to her. Her features were stark, her cheekbones high, and her eyes held a depth that seemed to have witnessed the world's cruelties and refused to blink. Her mouth was set in a firm, unsmiling line, as if she had decided long ago that joy was a luxury she could not afford. Her past was a shadow that followed her, a whispered story told with a mix of pity and scorn. Her husband, Jed Boone, had been a gambler and, some said, an outlaw, a man with a quick temper and even quicker hands. He'd been found dead in a ravine 2 years prior, a bullet in his back, the victim of a dispute over cards or a debt long overdue. His death had left Eliza with nothing but his tarnished name, in a community that clung to reputation like a life raft. Being the widow of Jed Boone was a stain that would not wash out. She was an outsider, tolerated for her skill in the kitchen and her tireless work ethic, but never truly accepted. She bore the town's judgment with a stoic indifference, wrapping herself in a cloak of trammack that few dared to penetrate. She lived on the fringes, a ghost in her own life, her heart a locked room to which no one held the key. Wade first laid eyes on Evelyn Mayfield on a Sunday, in the one place the heat and hardship could not entirely crush, the town church. The air inside was stuffy, smelling of dry wood and old hymnals, but it was a refuge. He sat in the back pew, as he always did, feeling the familiar distance between himself and the chattering townsfolk. And then he saw her. She was sitting beside her father, the Reverend Mayfield, a man whose faith seemed as worn and thin as his Sunday coat. Evelyn was like a creature from another world, in a room of sun-browned, work-worn women. She was pale and fragile, a hothouse flower mistakenly planted in the desert. Her dress was of a fine blue fabric, faded but still elegant, and her hands, resting in her lap, were slender and white, untouched by labor. Her blonde hair was pinned in a careful arrangement that seemed to defy the ever-present dust. She looked breakable, lost. When the Reverend spoke, his voice was frail, a reedy plea for deliverance and prosperity that sounded hollow against the reality waiting just outside the church doors. But it was after the sermon, as the congregation mingled, that Wade understood the true nature of the Reverend's sermon. He overheard him speaking to Mr. Abernathy, the banker. The Reverend's words were quiet, desperate, a thinly veiled advertisement. He spoke of the Mayfield name, of its history and good standing back east, of his daughter's gentle breeding. It was a pathetic, heartbreaking performance. The Reverend wasn't just preaching the gospel. He was auctioning off his daughter's future, trading her esteemed name for the simple promise of a roof over her head and food on the table. Anyone with enough property to provide for her was a suitable candidate. Wade watched Evelyn's face. She stared straight ahead, a faint, sad resignation in her eyes, as if she were a prize mare being paraded before potential buyers. The pressure on Wade was mounting. A visit from Abernathy made it brutally clear. The bank's patience had run out. The final notice would be issued in a month. Foreclosure was no longer a threat. It was a certainty. The news spread through the town with the speed of a prairie fire. The whispers followed him down the main street. Harlan's losing the place, they'd say, not with malice, but with a grim, knowing finality. It was the way of things. The land took what it wanted. He thought of the Reverend's desperate plea in the church. He thought of the girl with the pale face and the old family name, a Mayfield. The name carried weight. It spoke of old money, of honor, of stability. A man married to a Mayfield would be seen differently. A man married to a Mayfield might just convince a banker like Abernathy to grant an extension, to see him not as a failing rancher, but as a man of substance, a man connected to something respectable and enduring. The idea was cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of sentiment. It was a business transaction. He would be buying her name, and in return, he would offer her the shelter of his... He went to the Reverend's small, tidy home that evening. The air was thick with the scent of boiled cabbage and unspoken desperation. He didn't court her with pretty words or false promises. He laid out the situation with the stark honesty of a man with no time for pretense. He spoke of his struggling ranch, his debt, and his need for the credibility her name would provide. He offered her a life of hardship, but one of security. He would not lose the ranch. He vowed, not with her by his side. Evelyn sat beside her father, her hands folded in her lap, and listened without expression. When he was finished, a long silence filled the room. Then she looked at him, her blue eyes clear and direct for the first time. "Yes," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but firm. "I will marry you." There was no joy in her acceptance, only a weary resolve. It was a trade, her name for his protection, her past for his future. The night before the wedding, the sky finally broke. The rain came not as a gentle blessing, but as a violent, furious onslaught. Thunder rattled the windows of the small house, and lightning split the darkness, illuminating the drenched landscape in brief, stark flashes. Wade couldn't sleep. The house felt like a cage, the walls closing in on him. He was about to bind himself to a stranger, a ghost with a name, for the sake of his land. The weight of it was suffocating. He pulled on his boots and coat and went out into the storm, seeking a different kind of solitude. He headed for the barn. The familiar smells of hay, leather, and animals, a small comfort. As a flash of lightning lit the interior, he saw a figure standing by the stall of his horse, stroking the animal's neck. It was Eliza. She wasn't startled by his presence. She simply turned her head, her face partially shadowed. The sound of the rain drumming on the roof was a deafening roar, isolating them from the rest of the world. "Couldn't sleep," he said, his voice rough over the sound of the storm. "The rain is loud?" she replied, her voice low and calm. It was the most he'd heard her say in a week. He moved to stand beside her, close enough to feel the faint warmth radiating from her. They stood in silence for a long time, listening to the tempest. Two solitary figures adrift in the night. The air between them was charged with unspoken things, years of shared glances, of quiet understanding, of a loneliness that each recognized in the other. "It's a fool's errand," he finally said, the words torn from him. "This marriage—" Eliza didn't look at him. She kept her hand on the horse's mane. "You're doing what you have to do to survive," she said. It wasn't an accusation or a judgment. It was a simple statement of fact. She, more than anyone, understood the cold calculus of survival. "It feels like a betrayal," he admitted, though he wasn't sure of what or whom. "Sometimes," she said, her voice so quiet he had to lean closer to hear her over the rain. "The loneliest feeling in the world is lying next to someone who isn't there." Her words struck him with the force of a physical blow. She understood. She saw the hollowness in him, the ghost he was about to invite into his bed. In that moment, in the heart of the storm, she was the only person in the world who seemed real. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw the strength in the line of her jaw, the deep, weary wisdom in her eyes, the years of pain she held back behind her wall of silence. He didn't know who moved first. Perhaps they both did. It was a collision of solitudes, a desperate, sudden closing of the distance that had always separated them. His hand found her arm, and the feel of her, solid and real beneath her simple dress, was an anchor in the storm raging both outside and within him. He saw her eyes widen slightly in the dim light, a flicker of surprise, of vulnerability, before she closed them. What happened next was not born of love or passion, but of a profound and aching need. It was a raw, wordless confession of two people who had been alone for too long. In the darkness of the barn, with the storm as their only witness, they sought a moment of warmth in a cold world, a brief, fleeting reprieve from the burdens they carried. It was a desperate act of connection, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm of loneliness that defined both their lives. They clung to each other, not as lovers, but as fellow survivors finding a moment's shelter from the relentless storm. Eliza awoke to the gray light of dawn filtering through the cracks in the barn wall. The storm had passed. The air was cool and clean, washed fresh by the rain. She was alone. The space beside her in the hay was empty, holding only the faint impression of where he had been. There was no note, no word, just a profound and echoing silence. She rose, brushed the hay from her clothes, and smoothed her hair. Her face was a mask of calm composure, her expression unreadable. She walked from the barn to the small cookhouse, her steps steady, her back straight. She lit the stove, put the coffee on to boil, and began mixing the dough for the day's bread, her movements precise and automatic. Later that morning, she stood at the edge of the small crowd gathered in front of the church. She watched as Wade Harland, dressed in his best, if slightly worn, suit, stood at the makeshift altar beside the Reverend. She watched as Evelyn Mayfield, pale and lovely in her simple white dress, walked toward him on her father's arm. She heard Wade speak the vows, his voice clear and steady. She saw him place a thin gold band on Evelyn's finger. She saw the townspeople smile and offer their polite congratulations as the new Mr. and Mrs. Harland walked back down the aisle. Through it all, Eliza Boone stood perfectly still. Her hands were clasped in front of her, her face betraying nothing. She watched the man who had shared her loneliness in the dark marry a stranger in the light, as if the night before had never happened. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply watched, her heart a stone in her chest, while the world went on as if nothing had changed at all. The Harland Ranch did not welcome its new mistress. It met Evelyn with a persistent, hostile silence, a language of decay she could not comprehend. The main house, which Wade had cleaned as best he could, still bore the scars of neglect. The floorboards groaned under her light footsteps. The wind whispered through cracks in the window frames, and a fine, ever-present layer of dust settled on every surface, no matter how often it was wiped away. For Evelyn, who had been raised in the quiet, orderly world of a parsonage, this place was an alien landscape. It was raw, crude, and immense. The sheer, unending vista of brown earth and pale sky seemed to press in on her, stealing the very air from her lungs. She tried. In the first few weeks, she made a valiant effort to become a rancher's wife. She would emerge from the bedroom in a simple calico dress, her hair pinned neatly, and attempt a chore. But her soft, uncalloused hands were clumsy with a broom, and the weight of a water bucket made her stagger. The oppressive heat of the kitchen stove, where Eliza moved with an effortless, intimidating grace, would leave her feeling faint. A persistent, dry cough took root in her chest, a souvenir of the West's dusty breath. More often than not, Wade would find her resting in a chair, her face pale, a book lying unopened in her lap, her gaze fixed on the brutal, unchanging horizon. He would feel a familiar mix of pity and irritation. This was the bargain he had made. He had married a name, not a pair of working hands. Eliza remained a fixed, silent point in their new and awkward constellation. She lived in the small outbuilding, arriving at the main house before dawn and leaving after the last supper dish was cleaned and put away. She managed the two hired hands, a pair of grizzled, quiet men who respected her authority without question. She managed the dwindling supplies, stretching them with a skill that bordered on miraculous. She was the ghost that kept the dying ranch breathing. Between her and Wade, a chasm of silence had opened. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate avoidance. Their eyes would occasionally meet across the yard or the dinner table, a fleeting, charged connection that would be broken as quickly as it was made. His gaze was filled with a mix of guilt and a longing he refused to acknowledge. Hers was a placid, unreadable mask. But beneath it, a current of hurt and betrayal ran deep and cold. He was Mr. Harland now, and she was his cook. The storm in the barn, the desperate heat of their brief connection, was a memory locked away, a secret that hummed in the air between them, unspoken but ever present. Evelyn, in her innocence, felt the tension but could not name its source. She only knew that the quiet cook with the sad, watchful eyes made her feel like an intruder in her own home. One sweltering afternoon, seeking refuge from her own idleness, Evelyn explored the small, dusty room that Wade used as an office. It was a purely masculine space, smelling of old paper, leather, and tobacco. Tucked away in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a stack of unpaid bills and land deeds, she found a small, leather-bound journal. It was his handwriting was stark and black, the script of a man who wrote for purpose, not for pleasure. Most of the entries were simple records of ranch life, notes on cattle prices, weather, repairs needed. But then, she found a different kind of entry, written months before her arrival. It was not a record of work, but an outpouring of a soul. October 12th. The sky is the color of a fresh bruise tonight. The wind carries the scent of pine from the high country. There are times this land feels like it wants to break a man, to grind him down to dust. And then there are moments, quiet moments, When you see a hawk riding the thermals or watch the last light catch on the ridges, and you understand. It doesn't want to break you. It just wants you to be as strong and as honest as it is. There is only one person I know who understands this. She doesn't speak of it. She doesn't need to. It is in the way she moves, the way she looks at the horizon. She is of this land, silent, strong, unbreakable. To be near her is to feel a sense of peace I thought the war had stolen from me for good. A man could build a life on a foundation like that, a real life. Evelyn read the passage 3 times, her heart growing colder with each reading. He had loved someone. He had loved a woman with a passion and reverence he had never shown her. She closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. The words created a phantom rival, a faceless woman who was everything she was not, strong, silent, unbreakable, a woman who belonged to this harsh land. She placed the book back in the drawer, but the words were seared into her mind. From that day on, she watched Wade with new, suspicious eyes, searching for a sign, a clue, as to who this other woman might be, never once suspecting she ate the bread that woman baked every single day. The blow, when it came, was not from a rival but from the sky itself. It began as a strange yellow haze on the western horizon. The air grew still and heavy, charged with a menacing electricity. Then the wind came, a low moan that grew into a ravenous shriek, a wall of brown, churning dust, 1,000 feet high, descended upon the ranch, swallowing the sun and plunging the world into a suffocating, gritty twilight. The storm raged for 2 days. It was an assault, a physical battery. The dust was a fine powder that seeped through every defense, coating their tongues, stinging their eyes, filling their lungs. When it finally passed, the devastation was absolute. The fields of barley, their one hope for a profitable harvest, were gone, buried. The stalks that remained were stripped bare, withered and brown. The topsoil had been scoured away, leaving behind a hard, barren pan. Wade walked through the ruined fields, the limp in his leg more pronounced than ever. The dust storm had done what the war and the drought could not. It had finally and completely broken his spirit. He was ruined. He rode into a neighboring settlement a few days later, a place rougher than his own town, a haven for men who lived on the shadier side of the law. He went to see a man named Silas Kane. They had served together in the war, though on opposite sides of most regulations. Silas had a knack for acquiring things that weren't his, a talent he had honed into a profitable enterprise since the war. He was a lender of last resort, a man who dealt in desperation. Silas was dressed in a suit too fine for the dusty street, a large silver ring on his finger. His smile was wide and friendly, but his eyes were like a coyote's, quick, clever, and predatory. He listened to Wade's story with a sympathetic ear, then readily agreed to the loan. The interest rate was exorbitant, the terms crippling, but Wade had no other choice. As they were concluding their business, Silas's gaze drifted past Wade. "I hear you've taken a wife. Harland, a Mayfield, no less. You always did have a taste for quality." He offered to ride back with Wade, to pay his respects to the new bride. Wade felt a cold knot form in his stomach, but to refuse would be an insult he couldn't afford. Silas's visit was a disaster. He was charming, his manners polished, but his eyes devoured Evelyn. He complimented her home, her grace, her beauty, his words dripping with an insinuating intimacy that made Wade's fists clench. Evelyn, starved for the kind of genteel company she was used to, seemed to flutter under the attention, blind to the menace lurking beneath the surface. Silas Kane saw her not as a wife, but as another fine acquisition, another piece of property in a failing estate that he might soon own. The strain of the ruined crop, the predatory loan, and Silas's unsettling visit finally fractured the fragile peace within the Harland home. Evelyn found Eliza in the kitchen, her hands covered in flour. Evelyn's voice, when she spoke, was thin and brittle, stretched to its breaking point. "The journal," she began, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "His journal. He wrote about a woman he loved. Before me." Eliza continued kneading the dough, her movement steady, her face impassive. She did not look up. "That is his business, ma'am." "Is it?" Evelyn's voice rose, laced with a hysterical edge. "I see the way he looks at you, the way he doesn't look at you. It's you, isn't it? You're the woman from the book." Eliza finally stopped. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned to face Evelyn. Her gaze was direct, without pity or malice. It was the calm, steady gaze of a woman who had faced down far worse than a jealous wife. "What there is between me and your husband is silence, Mrs. Harland. Nothing more." "You were with him," Evelyn accused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I know you were. There is an intimacy between you two." The accusation hung in the hot, still air of the kitchen. Eliza did not flinch. She neither denied it nor apologized. Her face remained a stoic mask, but her eyes held a flicker of ancient sadness. "I don't fight for what isn't mine," she said, her voice low and even. She turned back to her bread. The conversation, as far as she was concerned, was over. It was at that moment that Wade walked in. He took in the scene at a glance. Evelyn, pale and trembling, tears glistening in her eyes. Eliza, her back ramrod straight, her shoulders radiating a rigid tension. The air was thick with a conflict that was deeper and more wounding than any argument over crops or money. He looked at his wife, at her fragile beauty and her very real distress, and for the first time, he saw past the inconvenience of her weakness. He saw a woman terrified of losing something she had come to value. He had married her for her name. But somewhere along the way, in this dusty, desolate place, Evelyn Mayfield had fallen in love with her husband. The realization did not bring him joy. It brought him a profound, suffocating guilt. She loved him, and he was bound to her. But his soul, his silent, wounded soul, still reached for the woman standing across the kitchen, the woman who would not even look at him. Later that night, he found Eliza in the barn, checking on a sick calf. The air was cool, smelling of hay and animals. It was the same barn, the same setting. But the storm this time was inside him. "What did you say to her?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. Eliza didn't turn around. "Your wife asked me a question. I answered it." "You have no right," he seethed, stepping closer. "You're making everything a mess. This was a simple arrangement. You are making it impossible." She finally turned, her eyes flashing with a fire he had never seen before. "I am making it a mess?" she shot back, her voice dangerously quiet. "I do my work. I keep to myself. I watch you bring a stranger into your home, into your bed, and I say nothing. I live with the whispers and the pity of this town, and I say nothing. Do not dare to lay the blame for your choices at my feet. Wade Harland." The sound of his name on her lips, spoken with such raw anger, broke something in him. All the frustration, the guilt, the failure of the past months. It all came boiling to the surface. He was trapped by his debt, by his land, by his duty to a woman he didn't love, and by his impossible longing for the woman standing before him. "Damn you, Eliza," he breathed, his voice cracking. He lunged for her, not in tenderness, but in a fury of desperation. He grabbed her arms, intending to shake her, to blame her, to force her to see the turmoil she was causing. But the moment he touched her, the anger dissolved into that same desperate need from the night of the storm. It was a fire that had been banked but never extinguished. She fought him for a second, her body tense, but then a shudder went through her, a sound that was half sob, half surrender. It was not a gentle coming together. It was a clash, a raw, angry, and deeply sorrowful collision. It was the breaking of two hearts that had been silent for too long, a desperate, hopeless attempt to feel something other than pain and loneliness. They fell back into the hay, their movements frantic, their touches fueled by a rage born of impossible circumstances. When it was over, a terrible, heavy silence filled the barn. They lay apart, not touching, the chasm between them wider than ever. Eliza was the first to move. She stood up, her movement stiff, and straightened her dress. She did not look at him. She walked to the barn door and paused for a moment, her back to him. Then, without a word, she stepped out into the darkness and was gone. The morning after their angry collision in the barn, Eliza did not come to the main house. The coffee did not brew. The scent of baking bread did not fill the air. A heavy, unnatural stillness lay over the ranch. Wade found a neatly folded piece of paper on the kitchen table. It was not a letter of farewell, held no recriminations or explanations. It was simply her final week's wages, calculated to the penny, with a small, smooth stone holding it in place. She was gone. The finality of it was as stark and silent as she was. He felt a hollowing out in his chest, a cold draft where her quiet, steady presence used to be. Eliza walked. She carried a small bundle with her life's few possessions, her back straight, her face set toward the distant smudge on the horizon that was the town and its train station. She did not look back. To look back was to acknowledge what she was leaving, and she could not afford that. The ranch, the man with the wounded eyes, the brief, stolen moments of desperate connection, they were part of a life that was never meant to be hers. She was Jed Boone's widow, a woman with a stained name, and her place was on the road, moving from one temporary existence to the next. That was her truth. The dream of something more, something permanent, was a dangerous folly. The path to town was a long, dusty ribbon cutting through the vast, empty land. She was halfway there, the heat of the late morning pressing down. When she saw the riders, there were 3 of them, materializing from a shallow ravine as if summoned from the dust itself. They were not cowboys. They were hard-faced men with a lazy cruelty in their posture. The kind of men who frequented saloons like the one Silas Kane owned. They fanned out, blocking her path. The leader, a man with a scarred lip that twisted his smile into a permanent sneer, tipped his hat with mocking courtesy. "Mrs. Boone, fancy meeting you out here, all alone." Eliza stopped, her hand clutching her bundle. She said nothing. Her heart began a slow, heavy beat against her ribs. "We heard you were leaving," the man continued, circling her on his horse. "Our employer wouldn't like that. He feels you have some unfinished business regarding your late husband, a certain debt. He's of the mind that Jed might have told his loving wife where he stashed the payment." "Jed left me nothing," Eliza said, her voice flat and steady. The man chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "We'll see about that. He's a persuasive man, our employer. He'd like to have a long chat with you." He nodded to his companions. They dismounted, their movements quick and brutal. Eliza didn't scream. She fought with a silent, desperate fury, but she was 1 against 2, and it was over in moments. They threw a coarse sack over her head, tied her hands, and hauled her onto the back of a horse. The world became a jolting, suffocating darkness. Word traveled on the wind in the west. One of the Harland ranch hands, riding the fence line, had seen the encounter from a distant ridge. He rode his horse into the ground, getting back to the ranch. His news a panicked torrent of words. 3 men, took her, headed south, towards the swamp. Wade felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a surge of ice-cold rage that burned away all thought, all guilt, all despair. There was only one thing left, a single, clarifying purpose. He didn't hesitate. He strode to the house, took down the Winchester rifle from above the mantel, and checked its action. He strapped his Colt revolver to his hip. He didn't speak to Evelyn, who watched him with wide, frightened eyes. He moved with the deadly efficiency of a soldier preparing for battle. The man who had been paralyzed by debt and doubt was gone. In his place was the man who had survived Shiloh. He rode south, pushing his horse into a hard gallop, the setting sun at his back and a gathering storm on the horizon. He found their trail near the edge of the cypress swamp, a treacherous maze of stagnant water, twisted trees, and sucking mud. By then, the storm had broken. A cold, driving rain began to fall, turning the world into a gray, weeping gloom. He dismounted, tethering his horse, and continued on foot, his rifle held at the ready. He moved with a veteran's instinct, his limp forgotten, his senses alive to the snap of a twig, the call of a night bird. He found them in a small clearing, a makeshift camp under the dubious shelter of a massive, moss-draped cypress. They had a fire going, its light flickering weakly against the downpour. Eliza was tied to a tree, the sack removed from her head. Her face was bruised, her dress torn, but her eyes, when they caught the firelight, burned with an unyielding defiance. The three men were passing a bottle, their guard lowered by the miserable weather and the whiskey. Wade didn't call out. He didn't offer a warning. Justice in this land was not a negotiation. He raised the Winchester, took aim at the man with the scarred lip, and fired. The rifle's report was a flat, brutal crack that echoed through the swamp. The man fell backward without a sound, before the other two could react, scrambling for their weapons. Wade had levered another round and fired again. The second man cried out and clutched his shoulder, his pistol falling into the mud. The third managed to draw his weapon, firing a wild shot that whizzed past Wade's head. Wade dropped to one knee, the mud sucking at his boots, and fired the Colt. The third man staggered and fell. The second man, clutching his bleeding shoulder, was on his feet, stumbling away into the darkness of the swamp. Wade let him go. He ran to Eliza, his knife flashing in the firelight as he cut her bonds. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a ragged whisper. "I'm fine," she said, though she was shaking. From cold or shock he couldn't tell. A shout came from the darkness. "You'll pay for this! Harland! Kane will hear about this!" The wounded man was disappearing into the morass. Wade knew they couldn't stay. Silas Kane would have more men, and they knew where to look. "We have to move," he said, pulling her to her feet. "We can't go back the way I came." They plunged into the swamp, into a world of darkness, rain, and unseen things that slithered beneath the black water. It was a primal struggle for survival. The mud pulled at their boots, and thorny vines tore at their clothes. They waded through waist-deep, chilling water, the rain a constant, hammering presence. Wade took the lead, his rifle in one hand, his other holding tight to Eliza's arm, guiding her, steadying her. They didn't speak. Words were useless here. All that mattered was the next step, the next breath. Sometime before dawn, exhausted and freezing, they found a small hummock of dry land, barely an island in the vast swamp. They collapsed at the base of a cypress tree, huddled together for warmth, the rain still falling around them. "He said Silas Kane sent them," Wade said, his voice raw. "They wanted to know about money Jed owed him," Eliza whispered, her teeth chattering. "There was no money?" In the cold, wet darkness, the barriers between them seemed to dissolve. They were no longer rancher and cook, no longer bound by an awkward, guilty history. They were two human beings who had fought for their lives and were now fighting to survive the night. He put his arm around her, pulling her close, and she leaned against him without hesitation. It was not a gesture of passion, but of shared humanity, a simple, profound need for warmth and comfort in a hostile world. They stayed like that until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, two survivors clinging to each other against the wilderness. The journey back to the ranch was a long, slow agony. Wade's leg was a throbbing torment, and Eliza was weak with exhaustion and cold. When they finally crested the last rise and saw the homestead, it was like a vision of a half-forgotten dream. Evelyn was on the porch. She had been there all night, a lantern burning beside her. She saw them coming, two mud-caked, tattered figures. Wade leaning heavily on Eliza. Eliza supporting him in turn. They looked like refugees from some terrible, unseen war. Wade led Eliza not to the outbuilding, but to the front door of the main house. He helped her over the threshold and eased her into a chair by the cold hearth. Evelyn stood frozen in the doorway, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. Her rival, the woman from the journal, the woman who had made her feel like a ghost, was now here, in the heart of her home, covered in mud and bruises, brought here by her husband. In that moment, Evelyn felt a sense of invisibility so profound it was like she had ceased to exist. Wade looked past her, his eyes focused only on Eliza. "Get water," he commanded, his voice hoarse. "And bandages, clean cloths." For a moment, Evelyn didn't move. A storm of jealousy, hurt, and bewilderment raged within her. But then she looked at Eliza's face. She saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the dark bruise on her cheek, the way she shivered uncontrollably. And beneath the anger and the pain, something else stirred, a flicker of the compassion her father had taught her, the simple human duty to tend to the suffering. She turned without a word and went to the kitchen. She returned with a basin of warm water and a stack of clean linen. Wade had sunk into a chair, his face gray with pain and fatigue. Evelyn knelt before Eliza. Their eyes met. There was no apology in Eliza's gaze, but there was a deep, weary vulnerability that Evelyn had never seen before. With hesitant, trembling hands, Evelyn began to clean the cuts and scrapes on Eliza's arms. It was an act of surreal, agonizing intimacy. She was tending to the wounds of the woman who had wounded her so deeply, and as she worked, the silence in the room was filled with the weight of everything that had happened and everything that remained unsaid. The days that followed were suffocating. The three of them were trapped in the small house, orbiting each other in a tense, miserable silence. Eliza recovered in the spare room, and Evelyn brought her meals. The exchanges brief and excruciatingly polite. Wade was consumed by a dark, brooding anger, his limp worse than ever, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if expecting an attack at any moment. The house, which had once felt merely empty, now felt like a prison, each of them locked in their own private cell of misery. One evening, Wade finally broke the silence. He found Evelyn sitting by the window, staring out at the dusk. He stood behind her, his voice low and heavy with contrition. "Evelyn, we need to talk." She didn't turn. "There is nothing to say." "Yes, there is," he insisted. He told her everything. Not about the nights in the barn. He could not bring himself to voice that particular betrayal, but about the long, slow-burning feelings he'd had for Eliza. "I cared for her, long before you came here," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. "But I never thought. It was never possible. She was Jed Boone's widow. The town, they would never have accepted it. I would have been an outcast. The ranch would have failed for sure. It was a dream I had to put away." He paused, the silence stretching between them. "Marrying you. It was a practical decision, a way to survive. I know that's a cold thing to hear, but it's the truth. I never meant to hurt you." Evelyn finally turned to look at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You didn't mean to hurt me," she whispered, her voice incredulous. "Wade, I am your wife, and you have brought the woman you love into our home. How could you think that would not hurt me?" She stood up and walked away, leaving him alone with the echoes of his ruinous honesty. The next day, Evelyn tried to lose herself in work. She was determined to prove that she was not useless, that she was not just a fragile ornament. She went to the storehouse, intending to carry 2 buckets of water to the house, a task she had seen Eliza perform countless times with ease. She filled the buckets, the wood groaning under the weight. She gripped the handles, her slender fingers straining, and tried to lift them. The weight was immense, pulling at the muscles in her arms and back. She took 2 staggering steps, then 3. A wave of dizziness washed over her. Black spots danced in her vision. The world tilted, and she collapsed in a heap on the dusty floor, the spilled water pooling around her. It was Eliza who found her. She had been on her way to the well and saw the open storehouse door. She found Evelyn unconscious, her face ashen, her breathing shallow, without a second thought. Eliza gathered the frail woman into her surprisingly strong arms and carried her back to the house, laying her gently on her own bed. She fetched a cool cloth for Evelyn's forehead and sat by her side, waiting for her to wake. When Evelyn's eyes fluttered open, the first thing she saw was Eliza's face, etched with a look of genuine concern. For the first time, there was no rivalry in the room, no tension, only the quiet care of one woman for another. A fragile bridge of compassion was being built over the chasm of their shared pain. The final betrayal came a week later. As dusk settled over the valley, Wade saw a flicker of orange against the darkening sky. It was coming from the direction of his grain silo, the one place he had stored what little remained of his assets, the seed for next year's crop. A cold dread seized him. He grabbed his rifle and ran. Silas Kane was waiting for him, flanked by half a dozen of his men. The silo was already engulfed in flames, the fire a roaring monster consuming his last hope. "Evening, Harland," Silas said, his voice smooth as silk. "A tragic accident. It seems your luck has run out." "This is your doing, Kane," Wade snarled, raising the rifle. Before he could fire, he was struck from behind, a blow to the head that sent him sprawling. Kane's men were on him, their boots and fists a brutal, punishing rain. They beat him with a methodical, dispassionate cruelty. Silas watched, a thin smile on his lips. "The bank will foreclose now, of course," Silas said, looking down at Wade's broken form. "And I'll be there to buy the note. This will be my land. And your pretty wife. Well, a lady like that needs a man who can provide." They left him there, a broken man in the dirt, his body screaming in pain, his eyes reflecting the light of his burning future. He had lost everything: the ranch, the crop, his pride. All that was left was a house with 2 women in it, and a darkness that threatened to consume them all. The smell of smoke was the first thing, a permanent ghost that haunted the house. It clung to the curtains, settled in the floorboards, and tainted the very air they breathed. It was the scent of absolute ruin. Outside, the blackened, skeletal remains of the silo stood as a monument to their destruction, a jagged finger pointing at a merciless sky. The Harland Ranch was a place shrouded in a profound and heavy gloom, a quiet purgatory of loss. Inside this pocket of despair, Wade Harland lay broken. The beating had left him with 3 cracked ribs, a concussion that swam behind his eyes, and a spirit so shattered it seemed beyond repair. He lay in his bed, drifting in a feverish sea of pain and memory, lost to the world. He was no longer the master of the ranch, the struggling patriarch, or the tortured veteran. He was simply a body in a bed, a source of pain. Shallow breaths that punctuated the suffocating silence of the house. His absence as a man of action created a vacuum, and into that void, against all odds, stepped his 2 women. They worked. It was all that was left to do. The world did not stop for their grief. The few remaining cattle needed to be watered, the chickens fed, the garden tended. Evelyn, the pale, fragile creature who had once been felled by the weight of a water bucket, now found a strength she never knew she possessed. It was not a physical strength, but one born of sheer, desperate will. Her movements were clumsy, her efforts often inefficient, but she did not stop. She learned to milk their one remaining cow, her soft hands aching and cramping until they bled. Then, calloused over, she learned to mend a fence, her brow furrowed in concentration as she wrestled with the wire and posts. Eliza, her own bruises fading, became the grim, silent engine of their survival. She moved with a tired, methodical purpose, her face a mask of stone. She rationed their dwindling food supplies, found ways to make meals from almost nothing, and worked in the garden until her back screamed in protest. She worked to keep the darkness at bay, to fill the long, empty hours with the simple, honest fatigue of labor. They worked together, two women from opposite ends of the earth, bound by the unconscious man in the bedroom and the ruin that surrounded them. They moved around each other in the beginning with a careful, awkward courtesy. But the shared burden of their daily struggle began to erode the walls between them. The silence, once thick with tension and rivalry, slowly thinned, filled instead with the simple sounds of shared work, the rhythmic chop of an axe, the scrape of a hoe on hard earth, the weary sighs at the end of a long day. In their shared exhaustion, they began to see each other for the first time. One night, as they sat a silent vigil by Wade's bedside, the stillness was broken by Evelyn's quiet voice. "I am not strong enough for this life," she said, her gaze fixed on her husband's pale face. It was not a complaint. It was a confession, uttered with a simple, heartbreaking honesty. "I was not raised for it. The sun is too hot, the work is too hard, the silence is too loud." She paused, her hands twisting a piece of loose thread on her dress. "When I first came here, all I wanted was to leave, to go back to a world of books and quiet rooms." Eliza said nothing, simply listening, her hands resting still in her lap. "But I will not leave him," Evelyn continued, her voice gaining a thread of steel. "I know he married me for my name. I know his heart belongs elsewhere. But he is my husband. This is my home now, and I will not abandon it. Even if I am not strong enough to hold him, I am strong enough not to let him go." Eliza looked at the younger woman then. She saw past the delicate features and the fragile demeanor. She saw a different kind of strength. Not the hard, weathered endurance she knew, but the unyielding strength of loyalty. It was a fierce and quiet devotion that Eliza, who had only ever known the selfish, fleeting passions of a man like Jed Boone, found both baffling and profoundly respectable. A few days later, they were in the garden, pulling the stubborn weeds that were the only thing thriving on the Harland ranch. The sun was relentless, and the work was backbreaking. It was Eliza who spoke this time, her voice low, the words seeming to be pulled from a deep, hidden well inside her. "I never believed I was worthy of being loved," she said, not looking at Evelyn, her hands continuing their rhythmic work. "My father was a hard man. He taught me that a woman's worth was in her work and her silence. And my husband—" She stopped, her hands stilling for a moment. "Jed taught me that love was a cage, a thing to be used against you." She looked up, her gaze meeting Evelyn's across the rows of struggling corn. "I built a wall around myself. I did not believe anyone could see past the name Jed Boone's widow. I did not believe I deserved to be seen." "Wade saw you," Evelyn said, her voice soft. A flicker of something, pain, gratitude, a deep and abiding sorrow, passed across Eliza's face. "Yes," she whispered. "He did. He never said the words. He never had to. But when he looked at me, I felt like I was more than just a ghost. He was the only person who ever made me feel like I still had value, like I was still a woman." It was a confession that laid her soul bare, explaining the deep, quiet pull that had existed between them, a pull that went far beyond mere physical desire. It was the recognition of two wounded souls who had found a sliver of worth in each other's eyes. Evelyn listened, and in Eliza's admission of her own profound loneliness, she found an echo of her own. The fragile understanding between them was cemented one moonless night. The house was quiet save for the sound of Wade's labored breathing. Evelyn was awoken by a new sound, a small, choked cry from the spare room where Eliza slept. She listened. It came again, a sound of such utter desolation it made the hair on her arms stand up. It was the sound of a heart breaking in the dark. Hesitantly, Evelyn rose from her chair. She crept to the door of Eliza's room and pushed it open. In the faint starlight filtering through the window, she could see Eliza thrashing in her sleep, Her hands clenched, tears streaming down her face. She was caught in the grips of a nightmare. "No," Eliza whimpered, her voice thick with sleep and terror. "So cold, all alone." Evelyn's heart went out to her. In that moment, Eliza was not her rival. She was not the strong, stoic woman who ran the ranch. She was a lost and terrified soul, trapped in a private hell, overcoming a lifetime of genteel reserve. Evelyn moved to the bedside. She reached out and took Eliza's clenched hand. The effect was instantaneous. Eliza's struggles ceased. Her breathing steadied. She turned her head toward the warmth of Evelyn's touch, her fingers instinctively curling around Evelyn's hand. She was still asleep, but the terror had passed, chased away by a simple human connection. Evelyn stood there for a long time, holding the hand of the woman she had once hated, feeling the slow, steady pulse of her life, the shared pain, the shared work, the shared confessions of the past weeks all coalesced into a single, profound moment of empathy. Leaning closer, so close that her lips almost brushed Eliza's ear, Evelyn whispered into the darkness, the words a promise to Eliza, to herself, and to the sleeping man in the other room. "If he needs us both," she breathed, the words a startling, radical truth that had formed in the crucible of their suffering. "I will not go." Wade returned to the world in pieces. At first, it was just sounds, the low murmur of female voices, a spoon clinking against a bowl. Then came images, blurry and disconnected. He saw Eliza's face, her brow furrowed with concentration as she changed a bandage on his head. He saw Evelyn, sitting in a chair by the window, a book in her lap, her posture straight and patient. He saw them move through the house together, not speaking much, but with an easy, synchronous grace, like two dancers who had long practiced their steps. As his mind cleared and his strength slowly returned, he began to observe them, a silent, baffled spectator in his own home. He saw the way Evelyn would bring Eliza a cup of water in the garden without being asked. He saw the way Eliza would drape a shawl over Evelyn's shoulders in the cool of the evening. He saw a shared glance, a small, tired smile, a partnership forged in the ashes of his failure. He, the man who had set them against each other, the source of their pain and rivalry, had become the axis around which their strange new alliance turned. He had wounded them both, and in their shared wound, they had found a way to heal each other. The realization filled him with a sense of awe and a shame so deep it was a physical ache. When he was finally strong enough to leave his bed, to walk on unsteady feet out onto the porch and see the ruin of his ranch with his own eyes, the fragile peace was destined to be broken. The unspoken arrangement, the silent coexistence, could not survive the return of the man at its center. It was Eliza who forced the issue. She found him one evening by the corral, staring at the setting sun as it painted the sky in shades of blood and gold. She stood beside him, her presence as quiet and solid as the earth beneath their feet. "You are stronger now," she said. It was not a question. "Getting there," he replied, his voice still rough. They stood in silence for a long time, the comfortable silence they had once shared. But it was different now. It was filled with the presence of a third person, a gentle ghost who was at that moment inside the house, humming softly to herself. "This cannot continue, Wade," Eliza said at last, her voice firm but devoid of accusation. "What we have done, what we have all become, it has no name. It has no place in this world." She turned to look at him, her eyes clear and direct. "You must choose." He had expected it. He had dreaded it. It was the only question that mattered. And he had no answer. He looked at her, at Eliza, the woman who understood the silence in his soul, the woman whose strength was a mirror of the land he loved. To let her go would be to cut out a part of himself, to willingly walk back into the lonely wilderness he had inhabited before her. Then his gaze drifted to the house, to the warm lamplight glowing in the window. He thought of Evelyn, the fragile girl he had married for convenience, who had shown him a strength of spirit and a fierce, unwavering loyalty he had done nothing to earn. She had loved him when he was unlovable. She had stayed when any sane woman would have fled. To send her away would be an act of cruelty so profound he could not contemplate it. Eliza asked him to choose one, but as he stood there, caught between the woman who was his anchor and the woman who was his harbor, he realized that they had become a single entity in his life. They were two halves of a whole he now knew he could not live without. To choose one would be to destroy them all, to shatter the strange, resilient, three-person family they had built from the wreckage of his life. He looked at Eliza, the question hanging in her eyes, and for the first time in his life, Wade Harland, a man of action and decision, could not answer. He could not speak. He could only stand there in the fading light, hopelessly, completely, and irrevocably divided. The circuit court judge convened in the town's largest saloon, the only building big enough to hold the crowd. The air was thick with the smells of stale whiskey, sawdust, and the unwashed curiosity of 100 townsfolk packed shoulder to shoulder. This was more than a legal dispute over a land deed. It was the best entertainment the county had seen in years. It was a morality play, and the entire town had come to pass judgment. Wade Harland sat at a makeshift table at the front, his back straight, his face a mask of grim determination. He was flanked by his two women. On his right, Evelyn, looking pale but composed in a simple gray dress, her hands folded primly in her lap. On his left, Eliza, a statue of stoic silence, her gaze fixed on a point just beyond the judge's head. Their presence together was a scandal in itself, a silent, defiant tableau that sent ripples of whispers through the crowd. Across from them sat Silas Kane, looking perfectly at ease in a tailored black coat, a confident smirk playing on his lips. He was flanked by his lawyer, a slick man from the city with a briefcase full of legal certainty. Kane's case was simple and brutal. His lawyer presented the loan document, signed by Wade, with its clear terms and punitive interest rate. He presented the date of default. He spoke of contracts as the bedrock of civilized society. It was, he argued, an open and shut case. Wade Harland had failed to meet his obligations. The land, by the letter of the law, was forfeit. Wade's own lawyer, a well-meaning but outmatched local man named Peterson, did his best. He spoke of the fire, of foul play, but he had no proof. He had only Wade's word against a signed and witnessed legal document. The mood in the room was grim. The townsfolk, whatever their private feelings about Kane, respected the cold, hard logic of a debt. Wade was losing. The noose of the law was tightening around his neck. "The defense calls Eliza Boone to the stand," Peterson said, his voice betraying a hint of desperation. A new wave of murmurs swept the room. Jed Boone's widow, the woman who lived at the Harland place, this was the heart of the matter, the source of all the gossip. Eliza rose, her movements fluid and deliberate. She walked to the stand, her head held high, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the palpable weight of the town's scorn. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore the oath, her voice low but clear, cutting through the saloon's stuffy air. Peterson began his questioning, asking her to recount the events of her abduction. She did so in a flat, unemotional tone, describing the men, the threats, their words about a debt her husband owed to their employer. Silas Kane, Kane's lawyer, leaped to his feet. "Objection! This is hearsay, the ramblings of known ruffians, which have nothing to do with my client or the matter of this loan." "Sustained," the judge said wearily. "Mrs. Boone, do you have any proof to connect these men to Mr. Kane?" "Only their words," Eliza admitted. "And this—" From a small pocket sewn into the inside of her dress, she produced a piece of paper. It was old, folded so many times the creases were worn thin, the paper yellowed and soft as cloth. She handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "What is this?" the judge asked, peering at the faded script. "It is a pledge, Your Honor," Eliza said. "Written and signed by my late husband, Jedediah Boone. I found it among his things after he died. I have kept it ever since." The judge began to read aloud, his voice gaining strength and interest with each word. The saloon fell into a dead silence, every person straining to hear. "I, Jedediah Boone, being of sound mind, though perhaps not sound soul, do hereby set down this truth. The dealings I have had with Silas Cain are a poison. His method is this: he finds a man on his last legs and offers a loan. He then ensures, through means fair and foul, that the man cannot repay. He takes the land, the cattle, the house. He did it to the Miller family south of here, running off their stock in the night. He did it to old man Hemlock, damming the creek upstream until his crop withered on the stalk. I have been his instrument in these things, a fact that sits heavy on me. I write this as my insurance. If my partnership with Mr. Cain should end badly for me, let it be known that his fortune is built on the ruins of good men. Signed, Jedediah Boone." The judge finished reading and looked up, his gaze like a steel spike pinning Silas Cain to his chair. Cain's smirk had vanished. His face was a mottled, purplish red. "This is a forgery," Cain's lawyer blustered. "The desperate fabrication of a grieving widow and a debtor." "Is it?" the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I presided over the Miller bankruptcy myself, and I recall old man Hemlock losing his farm. This document, signed by your own acknowledged associate, seems to describe a pattern of fraudulent and predatory behavior, Mr. Cain. A pattern that looks remarkably similar to the circumstances surrounding Mr. Harlan's accidental fire." He banged his gavel on the table, the sound making the whiskey glasses rattle. "In light of evidence suggesting criminal conspiracy and fraud, I find the loan agreement between Mr. Cain and Mr. Harlan to be null and void, case dismissed. The Harlan deed remains with Wade Harlan." Wade had won. But as he looked around the room, he saw no cheering faces, no slaps on the back. He saw only a sea of wide, staring eyes, filled not with admiration for his victory, but with a morbid, lascivious curiosity. He had won his land, but he had lost his name. The trial had laid bare the strange, nameless arrangement at the heart of his home, and the town, having rendered its legal verdict, was now preparing to render its social one. The rumors started before they even made it back to the ranch. They spread from the saloon to the general store, from the blacksmith's shop to the church sewing circle. Wade Harlan, living with 2 women, in sin. The story grew with each telling, becoming more lurid, more depraved. They were outcasts, a blight on the community's fragile sense of decency. A few days later, a delegation from the church arrived at the ranch. It consisted of 3 grim-faced deacons, their Sunday suits looking out of place in the dusty yard. They did not ask to come inside. They delivered their verdict on the porch. "Mr. Harlan," the eldest began, his voice devoid of compassion, "the council has met in light of the irregular and unchristian nature of your domestic arrangements, which have become a public scandal and a stain upon this congregation. We have voted to strike your name and that of your wife from the church rolls. You are no longer welcome in the house of God." Wade stared at them, a cold fury building in his chest. Evelyn stood beside him, her hand gripping his arm, her knuckles white. She did not cry or protest. She simply met their judgmental gazes with a quiet, regal defiance that seemed to infuriate them more than any outburst would have. The final blow from the outside world came in the form of a letter, carried by the mail rider. It was from Evelyn's mother. The handwriting was a series of sharp, angry slashes. It spoke of the shame and disgrace Evelyn had brought upon the Mayfield name. It called her arrangement an abomination. It ended with an ultimatum: leave that man and his whore immediately and return home, or be disowned, cast out from the family forever. Evelyn read the letter, her face expressionless. Then she walked to Wade's desk, took out a clean sheet of paper, and wrote a single sentence. "I am home." She sealed it in an envelope and handed it to the mail rider. She had made her choice. She had cast her lot with the outcasts. The town's hostility was no longer a thing of whispers. It was an open, ugly wound. They needed supplies, and it was Eliza who volunteered to go, as she always had. She rode the wagon into town, her face set in its usual stoic mask. But this time, the mask was a shield. At the mercantile, the proprietor served her, but his movements were stiff, his eyes cold. Other women in the store turned their backs on her, pulling their children closer as if she carried a disease. As she was leaving, a woman, one of the church deacon's wives, blocked her path. "You should be ashamed of yourself," the woman hissed, her face contorted with pious rage. "Living like an animal. You are a disgrace to all decent women." Eliza looked at her, her eyes holding a deep, ancient sorrow. She said nothing. She simply walked around the woman, loaded her supplies into the wagon, and started for home. Her silence was her armor, but each hateful glance, each venomous whisper, was a small, sharp stone striking against it. On the road back, she saw a figure walking toward her. It was Evelyn. She had grown worried and had started out to meet her. A small, grateful smile touched Eliza's lips. Evelyn climbed up onto the wagon seat beside her. They rode in a comfortable silence. Two allies against the world. They were halfway home when it happened. A man, his face obscured by shadow and drink-fueled courage, stepped out from behind a clump of cottonwoods. "Harlot!" he yelled, his voice thick with malice. He bent down, picked up a fist-sized rock, and hurled it with all his might. It all happened in a fraction of a second. The rock arced through the air, aimed directly at Eliza's head. Eliza saw it coming, but she was frozen, paralyzed by the sudden, vicious attack. But Evelyn was not. In that instant, all her genteel fragility vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective instinct. She did not scream. She did not hesitate. She launched herself in front of Eliza. The rock struck Evelyn high on the side of her head with a sickening, heavy thud. She crumpled without a sound, falling from the wagon seat into the dusty road. The attacker, sobered by the sudden, shocking outcome of his actions, scrambled back into the trees and disappeared. Eliza leaped from the wagon, her heart a block of ice in her chest. She knelt beside Evelyn. There was blood, a shocking amount of it, matting her blonde hair, staining the gray fabric of her dress a dark, terrible crimson. Wade was near desperate with a fury he had no outlet for. He had paced the length of the house 100 times, his fists clenching and unclenching. He had won his land only to have the world declare war on his family. He had brought Evelyn to this place for his own selfish reasons, and now she lay in their bed, hovering between consciousness and delirium, a life for a life, her blood shed for Eliza's. Eliza had cleaned and bandaged the wound with a skill that spoke of a hard life, but a fever had taken hold, and Evelyn's breathing was shallow. Late that night, he found Eliza standing by the window, staring out into the moonless dark. She was packed. Her small bundle sat on the floor beside her. She looked like a ghost, ready to be absorbed back into the night. "Don't," he said, his voice a ragged plea. "I have to," she replied, not turning. "This is my fault, my name, my past. It's a poison. I've poisoned this house. I've poisoned you both." He crossed the room in 2 strides and stood behind her, so close he could feel the rigid tension in her shoulders. "No," he said, his voice low and fierce. "This is not your fault. This is my fault, all of it, but you leaving. That won't fix anything. It will only break the last good thing I have." She finally turned to face him, her eyes shimmering with tears she refused to let fall. "There is nothing for me here. Wade, not anymore. I asked you to choose. You couldn't. The world has chosen for us." "The world be damned," he said, and his hands came up to grip her arms, not in passion, but with a desperate, pleading intensity. "Eliza, listen to me. What I feel for you. It's not what happened in the barn. It's more than that. You are the only person who has ever understood the quiet parts of me, the part that the war left behind. You understand the land. You understand the silence. Evelyn, she is my heart. She's the goodness and the loyalty I never deserved. But you are my soul. Do you understand? How can a man choose between his heart and his soul? His words, a raw confession torn from the deepest part of him, finally broke through her armor. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Then another. A choked sob escaped her lips. He pulled her into an embrace, and she sagged against him, the tears finally coming in a silent, wrenching flood. She cried for Jed, for her lost name, for the cruelty of the world, and for the impossible, beautiful, and broken family she had found here. After a long time, her sobs subsided. She pulled back slightly and looked not at him, but toward the bedroom where Evelyn lay. "My sister," she whispered, the words tasting new and strange and right on her tongue. It was the first time she had given a name to the bond that had grown between them, a bond forged in a crucible of shared pain and sacrifice. He left her then and went back to Evelyn's bedside. He sat down, taking her hand. It was hot with fever. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. Then they found his... She gave him a weak, fragile smile. "I heard," she whispered, her voice a faint, dry rustle. "She's not going." "No," he said, his throat tight. "She's not going." Evelyn's smile widened slightly, a look of profound and gentle peace settling on her features. She squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. "Good," she murmured, her eyes drifting closed again. "Now, I am no longer alone." Time in the West is measured not by the hands of a clock, but by the turning of the seasons. The winter that followed Evelyn's injury was a hard, lean one. The cold was a physical presence, seeping through the cracks in the house, and the silence of the snow-covered land was broken only by the mournful howl of the wind. But inside the small ranch house, something was slowly, quietly being reborn. Evelyn did not die. Her fever broke after a week of terrifying uncertainty, leaving her weak but alive. Her recovery was a slow, painstaking process, a journey she did not make alone. It was Eliza who nursed her, changing her bandages with gentle, competent hands, brewing bitter herbal teas that brought down the fever, and spooning thin broth between her pale lips. It was Wade who sat by her bed for hours, reading to her from one of her beloved books, his voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to anchor her to the world of the living. As the snows began to melt and the first green shoots of spring pushed their way through the hard, unforgiving earth, Evelyn emerged from the sick room, changed. The brush with death had scoured away the last of her genteel fragility, leaving behind a core of quiet, tempered steel. The world she had once viewed with fear and helplessness, she now saw with new eyes. It was a world that had tried to kill her and had failed. The Harland Ranch began to breathe again, its life force inextricably linked to the three souls who called it home. The two hired hands, having witnessed the fire and the beating, had long since drifted away. But the three who remained worked with the relentless energy of survivors. Wade, his body healed though his spirit still bore the scars, worked from sunup to sundown, his focus narrowed to the simple, honest tasks of rebuilding. He mended the fences, repaired the barn roof, and with a small loan secured from a sympathetic old rancher in the next county, a man who respected grit more than gossip, he bought a handful of new cattle and seed for a modest crop of barley. Evelyn, still not strong enough for the heaviest labor, found her own domain. She had a mind for numbers and order, a skill that had been useless in her previous life but was invaluable here. She took over the ranch's ledgers, her neat, precise script bringing a sense of control to their precarious finances. She learned the names and needs of each animal, discovering a gentle, patient touch that could calm a nervous calf or coax an egg from a stubborn hen. She was no longer trying to be a rancher's wife. She was simply becoming one, on her own terms. Eliza was the heart of the operation, the silent, steady rhythm that kept everything moving. She managed the garden, the larder, the daily flow of work, her knowledge of the land and its seasons seeming almost instinctual. The rivalry that had once defined her relationship with Evelyn had vanished, burned away in the fire of shared trauma. In its place was a deep, unspoken bond. They worked side by side, a strange but effective partnership, Evelyn's quiet order and Eliza's practical strength. They were no longer the lady and the cook. They were the east and west of the same small, resilient world. The nights were a time of quiet recalibration. The world outside, the world of judgmental towns and rigid rules, ceased to exist. Their world shrank to the warm, lamp-lit circle of the main room. The unspoken question that Eliza had put to Wade, the demand that he choose, had been answered not with words, but with the simple, undeniable reality of their lives. A choice was impossible because to remove one of them would be to cause the entire fragile structure to collapse. So they created their own arrangement, born of necessity and sealed by a love that defied all conventional definition. It was an accord built on respect, honesty, and a profound understanding of each other's wounds and needs. After the supper dishes were cleared, they would sit together, sometimes talking, sometimes in a comfortable silence. The tension that had once electrified the air was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. Their nights found their own quiet rhythm. The home had 2 bedrooms, and Wade's presence was a comfort shared, not a possession divided. Some nights, he would sit with Evelyn, reading to her as he had when she was sick, their closeness a tender, gentle thing built on loyalty and shared vows. Other nights, he would find Eliza on the porch, staring up at the vast, star-dusted sky, and they would talk in low voices, their connection a thing of the soul, a silent understanding that needed no flowery language. It was a life lived in the quiet spaces, a love defined not by the laws of men, but by the needs of 3 specific, intertwined hearts. There was no jealousy, for each woman knew what she gave and what she received was unique and irreplaceable. Evelyn held his heart, his goodness. Eliza held his soul, his wilderness, and he, in turn, held them both, the center of their unlikely universe. One evening, after a particularly long day of harvesting their small but healthy barley crop, they sat down to a supper of roasted chicken and vegetables from their garden. A single candle burned in the center of the table, its flame dancing in the twilight, casting their faces in a warm, soft glow. They ate in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the clink of forks against plates and the gentle chirping of crickets outside. When the meal was finished, they lingered at the table, reluctant to break the spell of peace. Eliza, her hands resting on the worn wood of the table, sighed a small, contented sigh. Without a word, Evelyn reached out and placed her hand over Eliza's. It was a gesture of simple, profound solidarity. A moment later, Wade reached across the table and covered both their hands with his own. His grip was warm and firm, a silent vow that encompassed them both. In that small, quiet moment, in the flickering candlelight of their home, they were not a man and his wife and his cook. They were a family, a complete, unbroken circle. They had built their own world, with its own laws. The first and only law was survival. The second was loyalty. The third was love, the judgment of the town. The church and the families they had left behind no longer mattered. Those voices were from a distant, irrelevant world. Their world was the stretch of land from the creek to the ridge, the sturdy walls of the house, the shared warmth of the fire. They were outcasts, and in their exile, they had found a kind of freedom the townsfolk, trapped in their cages of convention, would never know. Late in the fall, 2 men on horseback rode up to the ranch. They were not from the town. They were land assessors from the territorial government, making their rounds to evaluate properties for tax purposes. They were practical men, their eyes accustomed to sizing up a homestead at a glance, reading its story in the state of its fences and the health of its stock. Wade met them in the yard, his stance relaxed but firm. The men introduced themselves, their gazes sweeping over the ranch. They saw a barn with a newly patched roof, fences that were taut and strong, a small herd of cattle looking healthy and well-fed. They saw a garden that was still producing, and a neatly stacked woodpile ready for winter. Evelyn came out onto the porch, a ledger tucked under her arm. She greeted them with a polite, confident smile and answered their questions about crop yields and livestock numbers with a precision that clearly impressed them. A few moments later, Eliza emerged from the cookhouse, wiping her hands on her apron. She nodded a curt but civil greeting to the men and then spoke to Wade in a low voice about a problem with the well pump. He listened, then nodded. "We'll look at it after supper," he said. The assessors watched the exchange. They saw not a scandal, but a functioning, efficient partnership. They saw three people working in seamless harmony, each with their own role, their own authority. They saw a ranch that, against all odds, was not just surviving, but thriving. The lead assessor made a few notes in his book. "You've had a rough go of it. Harland, from what I hear," he said, his tone professional, not prying. "Fire the drought. But this place, it's solid. You're doing good work here." He tipped his hat to the women. "Ma'am, ma'am." Then he and his partner mounted their horses and rode away. They left behind a profound silence, the simple, professional approval of a stranger. A man who judged them not on their morals but on their merits was a balm. It was an acknowledgement that what they were building was real, that it had value. The story ends not with a great victory or a dramatic confrontation, but in a quiet moment, as all the most important moments do. The sun was setting, a spectacular, fiery explosion of orange, red, and purple that painted the vast western sky. The three of them were sitting on the top step of the porch, their work for the day done. Wade was in the middle, an arm around each of them. Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder, while Eliza rested against his other side, her gaze fixed on the horizon. A gentle breeze stirred the dry leaves, carrying the scent of pine and dust and the coming coolness of the night. They watched the last sliver of the sun dip below the jagged edge of the world, plunging the valley into a soft, blue twilight. There were no grand declarations, no pronouncements of love. There was no need. The love was in the comfortable silence, in the easy way their bodies leaned into each other, in the shared breath of three souls who had found their home not in a place, but in each other. A small, gentle laugh escaped Evelyn's lips. It was a sound of pure contentment. Eliza smiled in response, a rare, soft curving of her mouth. Wade looked from one to the other, a deep, quiet joy settling in his heart, and he smiled too. They were three outcasts, three survivors, sitting on the edge of the wilderness, their faces illuminated by the afterglow of a perfect sunset. They were whole. In a small journal, tucked away in a drawer, Eliza Boone wrote the final entry. He once married her for her name, but in this wild place, love is the only thing that holds us together. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to read your thoughts in the comments below and find out where in the world you're tuning in from. Please consider subscribing to the From Wild West channel for more stories from the heart of the frontier.